The reason for liberty is reason, is your mind, is the fact that you're a being of a particular kind who needs to act within the world in a particular way. And so when you're with and among other people, you need to recognize that this nature is the way you survive.
Welcome, everyone, to Unsafe Space. I'm your host, Carter Laren, and I'm joined, as almost always, by Keri Smith. Hey, Keri.
Hi, Carter.
Today, we are quite excited to speak with Mark Pellegrino. Mark is an actor and producer, most recently known for his work as Lucifer in Supernatural. You may also recognize him from other hit shows such as Dexter, Lost, Being Human, and 13 Reasons Why, or from any number of films, including The Big Lebowski, National Treasure, and The Number 23. What you may not know is that Mark is also an objectivist and the co-founder of the American Capitalist Party. He's been married to his wife, Tracy, since 2008, and they have 2 kids. You can follow him on Twitter at Mark R. Pellegrino. We'll put the link there in the show notes below. Or if you want less political content or less philosophical content, you can follow him on Instagram at Mark Ross Pelly. Mark,
that's where you get the.
Thanks for joining.
That's where you get the dog pics. Sorry, I had to tell
all
the dog fans.
Dog and cat pics, yeah. My animal family.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for joining us today, Mark.
Yeah, thanks for having me on.
I am excited to talk to you because it's not often that we get to talk to artists, be they musicians or actors, who have a social media presence that sort of goes against the grain. That is maybe in some ways counterculture. And my first question for you is, why haven't you been canceled yet?
They're trying. Let me just first express my disappointment that artists aren't counterculture. I mean, artists should be the barometer, the moral, ethical barometers of our culture. They should be questioning it all the time. They shouldn't be swimming with the flow of things, and yet they are. They're part of the establishment now. Yeah, the mob, Twitter mob especially, has tried to cancel me. I've had 3 successive waves of intensive, I guess, relational aggression, I guess you'd call it, that culminated in a change.org petition to get me fired from all of my jobs and my convention circuit. Luckily, all the people I work for and on every level know that I'm not any of the things that these people attempted to paint me as, and so personally told me that there would be no canceling taking place. But it was pretty frightening. I started a counter petition, which got tens of thousands of votes over theirs. Their petition eventually ended up getting canceled by Change.org itself because it was so vile. And every once in a while, they rear their ugly heads when they get bored chewing on some other carrion, and they go after me if I say something that goes against their I don't know what you'd call it. I would say their dogmatic perspective of the way life is and the way human beings should be.
Their religion, so to speak.
Their religion, yes, their secular religion.
Yeah. I mean, is it just Twitter that mobs that try and cancel you? Or there's a narrative right now that the Hollywood gatekeepers kind of demand this ideological allegiance. Is that an exaggerated narrative, or are you special?
Well, I think I'm fortunate in the sense that I'm not in the establishment at all. So the people on the left who are hardcore left don't see me as someone on the right. And I think because they can't define me, they can't quite cancel me. And now I don't think that there's definitely ideological conformity in Hollywood. I don't know that it's a conscious sort of discrimination. I mean, you want to work with the people you want to work with, who make you happy, who you don't feel you're going to be in conflict with all the time. So in part, it's innocent, and so I would have to say that meme, that idea of Hollywood elitists sort of pushing out competing ideas is is sort of half myth, half real. I don't think it's quite as organized as everyone would say it is.
There's no smoking room. There's a room of smoking guys sitting in the back deciding people's careers.
Yeah, it's just people who have the same values, wanting to work with people who share their opinions, and not wanting to fight too much with people who don't. Not that because I have different opinions with them would mean I would naturally be in conflict with them 24/7. I have very fruitful and interesting talks with actors who are on the left, and I think I'm able to do that because I'm not coming at them from a tribe, and I have no interest in upholding a dogma. I'm coming at them from the point of view of a rational individual seeking the truth, and so I feel like I make headway with people that way. But maybe it's an illusion. Maybe they're all going to come after me soon.
So would you say that since you said they don't view you as on the right, that's interesting because Carter and I talk a lot about how I don't actually think right and left matters very much anymore. I know it matters to a lot of people, so we are forced to talk in those terms of like, are you on the right or are you on the left? But I kind of view the biggest, I guess the most important division currently being between people who are authoritarians versus people who are for the individual, like individualists. And would you say that if you had to describe yourself to someone who views things in terms of right and left, like what is your political position? What's been your journey to where you are now?
Well, let me just go backwards a little bit and say that I think the actual political divide, which is unbridgeable, is between authoritarian and individualism. There's no compromise between the two. That's the binary relationship of politics. You either think the state is primary, the individual is primary. Any concession to the individual not being a primary leads to the very horrible things that we're seeing happening today. As far as the left and the right go, I sort of refer to the origins of the story left and right, which I think was the French National Assembly during the Revolution, where one side divided itself into where the assembly divided itself into the traditionalists and more or less the Jacobins, the quote unquote Republicans who were for a Rousseauian type of body politic. That means neither side was for an individual, right? A liberty, equality, and a fraternity is not an individualist motto. So you had people going purely for unbridled democracy, purely for monarchy, and that to me represents what the left and the right are today, except the model shifted. We're lucky in that the right seeks to conserve a tradition of classical liberalism because that's how our country was born. So in some sense, they have a classical liberal bent, which makes them slightly more grounded. They have an ethical sense that takes them out of the realm of the individual and into collectivism and compromises them in lots of ways. And on the left, we have the secular statists who I think embraced the Rousseauian body politic idea where you are subservient to not the state, but to the people, and the people have primacy over you. So I can't describe myself in any of those terms. I'm not left, I'm not right. I am an individualist and an uncompromising individualist.
I'm surprised that works. I mean, you must be doing something right because I also describe myself as an individualist, and that still gets me labeled a Nazi whenever I disagree with people on the left about something. So you must be way better at conversations than I am, because it seems like anyone who's slightly right of Mao is a Nazi nowadays.
Well, you have to define your terms for individualism and remember that they're coming at it from a different semantical point of view than you are. So you have to make sure they understand your terms and you understand theirs. And I think individualism, selfishness, rational, and egoism, ego itself, these are all terms that have taken on negative connotations over the generations, and it's about redefining them. It's actually about bringing them back to their true meanings, but for our current generation, it's about redefining them. So you have to be very clear on what you mean by individual. And it doesn't hurt that I read Peter Boghossian and James Lindsay's book, How to Have Impossible Conversations. I recommend that. This is a plug. Mm-hmm. They're two of my favorite intellectuals. I think James Lindsay is one of the most important intellectuals online right now. You can follow him at Conceptual James. He doesn't even follow me, and I'm giving him this. Peter Boghossian is a philosophy, PhD in philosophy teacher in Portland, who recently with Lindsay and Helen Pluckrose completely blew the door off social justice academia with an expose, and they tried to fire him, of course. He is my friend, and so this plug goes out to him too. And when you learn the skills that he provides in these books, you might find yourself winning over more people. Good.
I mean, we've interviewed James a couple times, and we have a book club, and we're reading Cynical Theories for our January book. So
great book. Can you do me a favor if you talk to James, tell him to follow me for Christ's sakes? I don't know what
I will. You know what? I'll send him an email after this conversation saying he plugged you, man. You got to follow.
I not only plug him, I plug him online tons of times. I'm like, this is the most important intellectual you'll find. I read Cynical Theories. I plugged the book Cynical Theories for Christ's sakes. I don't know what else to do with the guy. I can ask him on a date. Maybe I don't know.
Well, he is an amazing intellect, and I really appreciate what he's been doing. I want to. You mentioned language, specifically taking control of words like individualist and egoist and selfishness. And one thing that I've been struggling with is the word capitalist.
Can I add one before you continue? I'm
Please.
Sorry.
No.
Liberal. I want to take that back too. So thank you.
Yes. Thank you.
Keri will be happy with that. So Keri wants to take back the word liberal. And I'm kind of having mixed feelings about that personally, but I will admit, and I don't know if this is a defeatist thing, but I kind of gave up on the word capitalist. And I gave up because no one understands what it means anyway. And Michael Rechtenwald, I don't know if you know him, but if you don't, you would like him. So you should follow him and hear what he has to say. But Michael Rechtenwald did some studies on, he went back historically, and it turns out that actually the word capitalism was mostly negative, even from the very beginning. It didn't really mean, he likes to use the phrase free markets instead, because that at least is distinct. I'm wondering, you're the founder of the American Capitalist Party, so you've decided to defend the word. Can you talk about that a little bit now? How important is that word? And do you think it's possible to kind of, defend that word in a way where people don't think of the central banks and cronyism when they hear the word capitalist?
Yeah. So, I defend the word capitalism in the same way Ayn Rand defended the word selfish. And it's really about coming at economics from a moral point of view, which I think, unfortunately, libertarians don't do. Capitalism is simply an economic system that understands and acknowledges human nature as rational or predominantly rational, meaning that's the way you live in the world. It understands how a rational being interacts with the material universe, that it combines elements in the material universe to create new things, resources, which we call production, and that production and thought and reasoning are essential to human life. And so it creates a legal system whereby property, your time with the material world, is protected, and your mind is protected, so that you can think by creating spheres of nonviolence, which we call rights. And so, to me, capitalism is simply a recognition of the human being's unique terms of survival and the application of those unique terms in life, which is basically a system of objective law and spheres of nonviolence, so that humans can think and act for their own lives, to benefit their own lives. Did that make sense?
Yeah, it makes sense to me. I guess my question is, does that work? I mean, I still have a hard time when you say the word capitalist. There's a lot of pushback. Is it worth trying to save the word, or should we just move on and say, I don't know. I mean, von Mises, you're describing von Mises. I mean, if you read Human Action, that was actually a pretty good summary of human action. So
yes, sort of. Yes, I agree with you because I'm a big von Mises fan. I agree that I am sort of using describing von Mises, but I'm not really a praxeologist. I don't really ascribe fully to the way he describes capitalism. Go ahead.
No. I get the difference. I mean, what von Mises didn't do was talk about the morals. He was only talking about it from an amoral perspective as a practicality. This is what works, and this is why it works based on human nature. Whereas someone like Rand came at it from a moral perspective, and this is why it is the moral system. They happen to actually completely overlap eventually. They just kind of
as they would the practical and the moral do overlap. Yeah.
Yes. If you get the answer to the question, the moral correct, they overlap. So
yes.
Yeah. So I don't know. I guess when you founded the American Capitalist Party, what's the goal with that? Is just to educate people about, hey, there's something different than the Democrats and the Republicans, and this is what it is. I mean, what's the purpose behind that? Have you been running candidates? I mean, what's the plan?
I've approached a couple of people about candidacy, but of course they have to go where the deep pockets are, and the deep pockets were with the Republicans at the time. I approached Austin Peterson to be one of the first candidates when he was running. I think he was running for the Senate in Missouri. I approached another guy in Colorado who ran as an independent and did fairly well, but he was a little bit leery about starting a grassroots program. Primarily, we wanted to get the ideas out in the world because we have basically two sides of the same coin. One side is the Democrats and the Republicans, who are versions of the status, and we have the irrational response to that, which is the Ancaps, the anarchists, who claim that the state shouldn't exist. And that's a false dichotomy. And so we decided to put forth a platform that people could refer to as an intellectual grounding, as an anchor, so to speak, in the hopes that we could generate some interest at some local level in some state or a city government, where somebody would start the process of formalizing a party candidacy. And so, I haven't been actively looking for anybody at the moment, but the ideas are there for anyone to latch on to. Many people look at the ideas and can't distinguish the differences between us and the Libertarian Party, which is disturbing. It just makes me feel like people can't think as clearly as maybe they could at one time. But for now, yes, it's an alternative to the state or the non-state. It says our version is, yes, the state is necessary. Because force isn't a market commodity. It needs to be restrained, and by these things we call constitutions. and once force is restrained and delimited and codified strictly, then people can do pretty much whatever they want as long as they're not using force against anybody else. But the state is necessary to preserve that peace. It's necessary to adjudicate differences and conflicts between people that would arise, even if they were perfectly moral. So yeah, we're an alternative, ideologically, ethically, politically, to the crap that's out there right now. I'd like to still come up with a better way of defining capitalism for you. I said it in sort of academic terms, but I think I could say it in a way that most people would relate to. I mean, whenever I discuss capitalism with people, I just make it about liberty, human liberty, and it's simply a system of human liberty. So we can get into the weeds with that if you want to at some point. But
yeah, I'd also like to tease out this difference because so this is where you and I will diverge. But just so you know, my philosophical background, I'm very well versed in objectivism. I used to speak at the Ayn Rand conferences. Like I know objectivism pretty well. I went on a journey similar where I would say small L libertarian because I hated the big L. I hated the Libertarian Party. And actually, as you I think are alluding to, there aren't principles behind libertarianism in the same way. There's not the moral foundation of libertarianism, but I don't think people understand that argument very much. I think when you say what you're saying and you talk about liberty and individual rights, my expectation is that most people still aren't sure why you are throwing libertarians under the bus. So can you distinguish between what's wrong with libertarians or libertarianism? I won't say people. Ideology.
In my view, in my humble view, I think libertarians don't understand the nature of a tool. So they don't understand that liberty is a social tool. They see liberty as an end, not a means to an end, but an end in and of itself. So that because they do that, liberty is separated unintentionally from its source. The reason for liberty is reason, is your mind, is the fact that you're a being of a particular kind who needs to act within the world in a particular way. And so when you're with and among other people, you need to recognize that this nature is the way you survive. And how do you protect that mechanism? Well, by these spheres of nonviolence, by creating a wall we call rights around you and your fellow man, where they are prohibited from keeping you from thinking and reasoning and living in the world. And so liberty is the tool by which we achieve a rational life. Now, certainly, you have volition, so you can make all kinds of bad choices in your life, none of which would fall under the metric of being illegal, right? But me as a capitalist and a non-libertarian would say, well, if you're doing bad things to yourself, the laws of nature catch up with you eventually. If you're doing bad things to others, the laws of men catch up with you. Now the reason, but liberty is not an end. It's not whatever I want to do. Even though it amounts to that, the purpose of liberty is to be able to live a rational life. So it's protecting reason. And I don't think that's in any libertarian literature that I've ever read. In fact, when I read the Libertarian Manifesto by Murray Rothbard, he made some of the most astoundingly ridiculous claims I've ever heard. Like a person adjudicated mentally insane cannot be institutionalized against their own will. Literally a person who has no capacity to reason. Right. I think he also said something along the lines of it's an infringement of somebody's liberty if you're a parent to be compelled to take care of your children. I mean, when you separate liberty from reason, and it just becomes an end, and then it becomes a tool of just unbridled will and libertinism, and it becomes a caricature of itself. There's no possible way you could justify liberty in those terms to any thinking human being. Right.
And I that makes sense, right? This is because this is an inversion of the conceptual hierarchy. Like liberty as a conclusion is the result of more fundamental philosophic premises. But I still want to push back a little bit because from my perspective, a lot of libertarians, and I'll put this in quotes, but a lot of people who are libertarian really haven't thought about this that deeply. And they just have some gut sense that, hey, we have some kind of rights and libertarianism is going to help us, help keep the state from infringing on those rights. And it almost seems like, why not go into the libertarian movement and try and educate them? Or do you think it's just not worth it even? Because I see a lot of libertarians actually do. If you have those conversations, a lot of them are fans of Ayn Rand. A lot of them read Rand, eventually come to the same conclusions. But they start with libertarianism because there's just an intuitive sense of like, hey, we're being oppressed. Our rights are being infringed. Who's talking about rights? Oh, it's the libertarians. And they kind of go over there.
Yeah, but the intellectual leadership isn't going over there. The intellectual leadership is the anarchists. Now, so it's like, okay, and those people have thought about it. And I've discussed ad nauseum online, tried to convince anarchists of the legitimacy of the state. It is impossible. It's an article of faith to them, and it is unshakable. And in part because it's like it feels like we're in a realm of I don't know how to say this. It's unprovability, or where you can't disconfirm things so much, like the ethical realm. You sort of have to reduce concepts to perceivable things and say, that's it. See that right there? And it becomes difficult, since you can't prove these things in a laboratory, to some of the even more thoughtful libertarians, to convince them that they're actually basing their concepts on inverted hierarchies and sort of the wrong way of looking at humanity and the state. They don't even acknowledge. Look, you'd think of thinking libertarian even like a Tom Woods, who's got a PhD in history from Harvard and Columbia, would be able to see the vast improvement in the nature of the state from its origins as city-states and empires to its fruition in the United States, but they don't. They don't even see the founding documents or the Magna Carta or the concept of trial by jury, or any of these evolutions that ended up becoming protections from the individual and between the individual and the state, and they don't even see those evolutions as evolution. They almost have a creationist view of government, which is sort of a spontaneous thing. This is what it is. It doesn't evolve. It doesn't change. So many people have that kind of notion about human knowledge, and so that's why you have people holding historical figures to the same moral standards that we have today. They don't understand how ethics has evolved or knowledge has evolved, and the libertarians don't understand how government has evolved. So when you point to the fact that we had the freest state that ever existed in civilization at any time, and that there were clear contradictions within the founding documents and within the principles of the founders, where statism was able to seep in and metastasize, they still don't buy it. They just say the state by its nature is a monopoly on force, and because it's a monopoly, it's bad. Monopolies are bad, and so they pretend that the state and force, like any other value in human life, is economic, and if you put it on the market, that kind of competition would actually solve the problem, when that's not true at all, for a billion reasons.
Okay, if Keri doesn't mind, I want to open. Can we open this can of worms, Keri? Do you mind?
Well, go right ahead. Before you do that, I wanted to just go back 1 second and talk about language, because I know Carter's about to go off in this Ancap direction, and that's a little out of my field of experience. But I did want to talk about language. I think it's a great thing that you are working to take the word capitalist back, because as you mentioned, the word liberal is a word that I've seen the degradation of that word. I've seen what's happened to it. And I used to be in what is referred to most often as the social justice left for about 20 years. And I thought what I was pushing was liberalism, but it wasn't. And I know a lot of people who are still in that world who think of themselves as, I'm a liberal, this is liberalism, or even progressivism. When I would actually say, if you look at how this ideology behaves and what its goals are, it's regressive. And so a lot of people are using that word when they support things that are very illiberal, as I'm sure you know, like things like censorship or the initiation of force. I wondered if you could define when people ask you, the way you do with capitalism, when people ask you what liberalism means to you, if you could give us your definition of that word.
It means allowing the individual the widest degree of freedom possible. It means that force is only used in retaliation. It's banned from all human affairs, except as a retaliatory measure against the initiation of force. So liberal has its roots in liberty, right? It means freedom, and that to me means an unfettered human being who can do what he thinks is right for his life or her life, without a third party interfering in any respect, with respect to his own life or her life, and in exchanges with voluntary exchanges with other people. So that's what liberalism means to me. And I have to say that I think I was one of the first people to change this dynamic when I went on Dave Rubin, I want to say like 4 or 5 years ago, and he was using liberal in a different sense. And I said, look, let's take back this term liberal, because liberalism is responsible for the Enlightenment, for the scientific revolution. Liberalism is what gave us all of the progress that we see today. It's leftism. It's this state concept and altruism and collectivist, monstrosity that is degrading our culture today. And I would even put progressivism in that realm. Progressivism, to me, was the beginning of a real Jacobinism, a kind of a real attempt on the part of the elites in government to subvert rule of law, to subvert objective law, to not be bound by any restraints, and to use the government as a means of achieving social ends. So I would say progressive is regressive. It's always been that way from the very beginning, and it's in the late 19th century. And it's just what we're seeing now is a consistent embodiment of it.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that. I'm going to let you get into your Ancap stuff, Carter. I wanted to say to you, because I don't know if you and I have ever talked about this explicitly before, but I know that you were thinking of maybe the word capitalist can't be salvaged, but the way that I view it is the more territory that you cede, whatever word you come up with, if you call yourself a voluntarist, they're still going to take that word and change that word. Like you're going to continue to cede ground when it comes to language. And so I much prefer just to draw the line in the sand and to clarify to people what these words actually mean. What is the history of the word?
I think you're probably right.
And I agree with you, Keri. I mean, I want to say that language to the social justice warrior is not a tool of cognition. It's a bullet. It's a gun. It's a weapon. It's a means of getting dominance over your opponents.
Right.
So it's absolutely it's important that we take all the liberalism back. See, liberalism, you can hide behind liberal and think you're good. You can advocate the worst shit on the planet, but you're pushing ahead of you the corpse of a virtuous being, and doing all kinds of crap with this corpse in the front of you, so that people give you a moral pass. No more moral passes. If you're on the left, you are not good. You're not good.
Well,
I like that.
I'm maybe you're convincing me on that. I mean, maybe it was just my defeatist attitude of we're never going to get capitalism back. But if you're going to go after the word liberal, that's a tougher battle. I mean, that's been tainted for much longer than capitalism, as you've pointed out. I mean, progressivism has encroached for over a century on the word liberal. So I do want to get back to the Ancap thing a little bit, because man, you mentioned Tom Woods, and he's like, how does he not understand the evolution of the government, and the government has evolved? And I would argue that he probably does understand that. I would guess, but I don't know. I won't speak for him. But there's this heartburn that I have with respect to the idea that a piece of paper will necessarily change the way people behave. Like if we fix the Constitution, people will behave differently. And it seems to me like, and this is one of the reasons we focus more on philosophy and culture in the show. It seems more like we need to lay the groundwork for people to be thinking in correct philosophical terms and have a culture built around the concepts you're talking about before we have any hope of any kind of apparatus, whether it's a state or whether it's any kind of Ancap. It doesn't matter what it is. Nothing will really be supported in society if we're a whole bunch of Marxists. No structure is going to stop us from being a whole bunch of Marxists. Does that make sense?
Okay, so first of all, I want to say, even though I disparage Tom Woods, I read his books, I listen to his podcast. I actually like the guy quite a lot. And I also subscribe to Liberty University. So
great stuff there, actually. Yeah.
I say that with also, and I should have probably complimented him first because I'm a great admirer of his work. And I'm probably one of the few objectivists who does like him, because one of my other mentors, Yaron Brook, does not like Tom Woods and will give him no quarter. Secondly, I wanted to say, we have constitutions because people's behavior doesn't change. That's why we have constitutions. in a certain respect, you're absolutely right. The real shift that has to take place is a cultural one, wherein when the Declaration of Independence was written, the culture was a certain way, and it wasn't it wasn't brand new in 1776. It came from 100 years or more of benign neglect on the part of the mother country and rugged individualism on the part of the population. So they had a certain sense of life that was just there, that somebody like Locke and then later Thomas Jefferson and Mason and all the great founding fathers were able to articulate very clearly. But they were articulating a sense of life. And until you have that sense of life saturating the culture, you're right. Constitutions don't necessarily protect you. However, they won't protect you if they have paradoxes, if they have cracks in them, if they're not consistent. You can't talk about general welfare necessarily and at the same time uphold individual rights. You have to make a consistent document that is clear. You, for example, can't have these fights between implied and enumerated powers. The government has enumerated powers. That's it. Everything else goes to the local people. And once there's no conflict about that, the natural human tendency to humans have limitless ambition. That applies to people in business. It applies to people in government. People in government will take everything they can if they can. So what you have to do is understand the Constitution guards against that propensity in human nature. That's why we have the Constitution. That's why there can't be no Constitution or just freewheeling, competing protection forces. But you just have to make it so philosophically sound, so integrated a document that you can't misinterpret it. It should be law, like moral law, should be self-explanatory. I mean, the reason the Constitution was written in so few words was because the founders understood that law should be apprehendable by all. There shouldn't be anything in it. Even Lysander Spooner talks a lot about it. That he almost acts as if common law is sort of a natural instinct. Like you as a juror should be able to sit down and hear a case and decide based on common sense whether or not a law is wrong or right or wrong. And you should, as a juror, have that right of veto to say this law is absolutely wrong. So there shouldn't be 20,000 pages of statutes and articles with legalese a mile long. You shouldn't need a special degree to understand what the nature of government is, how it's supposed to operate, what rights are, how the various houses of government compete with one another in a checks and balances nature, why pure democracy is bad, why we balance it with Republican constitutionalism. These things should be fairly clear. And when they're fairly clear, it's not like there's going to be no problems. It's just it's a human propensity to exploit power or advantage or any of the other things that a human being will do will be severely hampered.
I mean, even the Romans, I think, understood the importance of simple, transparent laws that are publicly displayed in the town square for everyone to see. Right? I guess they were responding to some, we'll call it pushback before they did that, but they got there. But we just spoke about the words capitalism, the word liberal. I think you mentioned several other words at the beginning of this show. If you're going to have a constitution, let's say you have an airtight constitution in the sense of it's got it lays out the philosophical foundations. Everything's very clear. It's perfect. Doesn't it need to come with a dictionary? Because otherwise, as we've seen, the postmodernist inspired left will just take a word, change its meaning, and suddenly the floodgates are open to all manner of sin.
Yeah, people could play semantic games with anything. It doesn't matter how clear you are. There's going to be somebody to come along and try to complicate it and exploit it to their own uses. But really, if it weren't for government compelling this postmodernist, ancillary postmodernist ideas onto vulnerable student bodies, and then imposing them into workplaces and imposing them into the government mechanisms for hiring, those ideas would be dead, because they are completely irrational. And they're not hard to beat up on. Yeah, individually, when you discuss ideas with some of these folks, they just go around in circles. There is a linguistic protective mechanism within social justice theory that enables them to be immune to logic, and part of that is to declare logic as just another power structure. I mean, when Foucault came up with this stuff, he may have been having fun in France, but I think he was really destructive, really destructive. I mean, it's self-detonating if you think about it for half a second, but these people don't think about it for half a second. They get lost in these linguistic cycles. My point is, they're pointless. They only have power because we allow them to. If you start pushing back, they lose.
I think one of their defenses is actually. I think one of the defenses of social justice, or a way that they defend themselves, is that they make it very hard to understand what they're trying to say. So to your point about how laws or the Constitution should be something that is comprehensible for everyone, they purposefully write in this pseudo, intellectual jargon that it's really hard to even parse what they're saying, so that the average person will come away from it thinking, well, this must be over my head. Like, I just don't understand it.
Yeah, and this is one of the reasons I think so many academics have contempt for Ayn Rand, because she wrote in plain language. She actually wrote some very complex conceptual ideas. I mean, her theory of concepts is a very complex analyzation of how your mind interacts with the material world. It's comparable to anything out there. It's written in a way that most people can get it. I mean, some of it's dense and you have to really work your way through it, but it's not dense like Kant or Foucault or the postmodernists who wrote deliberately obscurantist texts that, confounded you. I was on a debate series a little while ago with a professor of philosophy who's a friend of mine, Rick Rapetti. He's a great guy. Mark Gleason, who has a show, Level to Power. And we were debating this Kantian guy. And online, I was talking to him, where I'd say, look, I don't think the object of language is to tie your brain up in knots and paralyze you conceptually. The purpose of philosophy and language is to make the world clear, right? That's, like, for example, I said, when I was in college, I tried to read Ulysses by James Joyce. I got 40 pages into it. I said, this is an impossible novel to read. It's the #1 novel in Time Life magazine, and it's an impossible book to read. It goes 85 pages without a punctuation mark. 85 pages.
Jeez.
It is stupid. And this guy, who was nearly a professor of Immanuel Kant, was like, no, it's a great book. You just don't understand it. And I said, of course I don't understand it. So I'm not meant to. Just because it's ridiculously complex and stupid doesn't make it good.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you're making me think of Critique of Pure Reason, which I remember trying to pick that up 20 years ago and going, I think I made it through most of it, but I don't know what I read mostly. I read the words, but it's certainly not easy to read. But so, okay, so I guess I like what you're saying, but I want to. Here's why I want to push back, just to be transparent. I consider myself an Ancap, so you can put me on your blacklist. But
no. I want to hear what you mean by that. I can't put you on a blacklist not knowing what you mean by that.
No, that's fair enough. What kind of a social justice guy are you? You can put me on a blacklist. You can put me on a blacklist right away. I'm a white guy.
Yeah, that's true. Well, plus I like a lot of ANCAPs and I like the things they have to say. I just think they're wrong when we get into the weeds. But let me hear what your point of view is.
Well, sure. I think I agree with you about the libertarians in the sense that they are starting from a conclusion and missing out on the philosophy that grounds what they're supposed to, like their alleged viewpoints. And it's actually also, you get a lot of weird hedonism and as you said, like libertine, just kind of craziness in the libertarians as a result of this. And actually, you've seen the Libertarian Party start to turn a little social justice-y. I wouldn't describe them as anarchist. I think some of them actually seem to want hate speech laws and stuff like that, which isn't really anarchist. It's kind of more authoritarian. So I don't know where they are. But, when I look at the fundamental philosophy behind this, and I say, okay, what's required for man to live? Reason. Okay, the value of reason. Basically, we just start with objective metaphysics and reason as epistemology. Like, okay, great, and we can get to individual rights from that in the way that you talked about, without kind of any disagreement there. And then I get to this point where I say, okay, well, what's the best way in society to get to a point where those rights are somehow protected and not infringed upon? Because that's the ultimate goal. If I could wave a magic wand and there would be like, what was that movie? The old movie, The Day the Earth Stood Still, not the remake, but the old one where like the robot would come in and act against anyone who initiated the use of force. Like, if I could wave a magic wand and have a band of robots rule us that were perfect, like that would actually be kind of okay with me. Like, weird dystopia aside, if you think about robots. But I look at where the U.S. is now, and I see the progression of government. I also see, obviously, the expansion, and I recognize the flaws in the Constitution. I am concerned about interpretation of no matter what's written. I think you make a great point that if it wasn't for government education, maybe all this postmodernist and critical theory stuff would be gone, and then we wouldn't have to deal with it. So I'll concede maybe that's true. But I would like to get to a point in society where Ancaps can be having arguments with basically what I'll call like a minarchist or a capitalist, like someone who's the Randian view of the state. They're taking responsibility for defense and the courts, and they're basically just limited to protecting individual rights. And if we get to a point where we're in that state, then I'm actually not clear, because I don't think that's the ideal solution. My gut, this is not a good argument when I say gut, so let me back up. I think there are inherent problems with giving monopoly of force to a particular group of people, and but I don't have a better solution. I'm not saying I have a better solution, because bulldozing the state today would be way worse than what you're talking about. Way worse. So I'm an ANCAP who's not advocating for anarchy. I'm an ANCAP who's saying, let's get to this minimal government place. Once society can sustain a minimal government, I'm not 100% sure that a government will be necessary after that. But we need to get to that place first, because I do believe that culture and philosophy is a necessary foundation. The right culture and the right philosophy is necessary in order to perpetuate whatever system we have. So if we're in a world where taxes aren't forcibly extracted, but you are I would voluntarily donate to a government that, kept China from bombing San Francisco. Like, okay, like if I was voluntarily donating to a government that was doing only the things that it ought to do in the moral sense of what you're talking about, maybe the argument for our anarchy, like an ANCAP environment, would be pretty small and minimal. But I think it won't really be obvious until that point, and until we have a culture that supports that the individual rights, for lack of a better term, until we have a rational culture that's supporting individual rights. I don't think either one of those systems can work. Does that make sense? So as I'm like, ultimately, I think actually ANCAP could be where humanity needs to go, but I don't think we jump there. I think you have to get there through building the foundations philosophically, building the foundations culturally, and and vectoring through a minimalist government. I don't know if that was I explained it well, but
I don't think force is a commodity open to market competition. Because a market is defined by the absence of force. Number one.
Yep.
Number two, when you're seeking something in a marketplace, who is you are acting for your own values. When you're using force against another, you're imposing your will on another person.
Right.
There is no way that this act of imposing your will upon another person can be in any way subjective, like a market can. I go for my own values. I pursue my own values. My context guides me. Sometimes it's rational, sometimes it's not. But it's my own kind. It's completely subjective in that sense. I don't like that term, but let's just say contextual.
Yep.
But there's no such thing as subjective uses of force that are appropriate. To me, a competition between force entities is called war. And that's what you would eventually have with many different competing agencies, because what is it that they're competing for? Well, who's the strongest? They're competing they're competing in the realm of force. It's not about, the anarchists try to say, no, it's about, efficiency. It's about efficiency in what? And by what standard? I mean, so many anarchists I know, when I pose this hypothetical to them, if I were able to come up with a completely rights-respecting government, in other words, we had separation of church and state, separation of economic activity and state, and those were sort of the two commandments that guided the government, would you still pay taxes? No. All right, so I just see what you are as a dude who wants to freeload. You just want to do your own thing. You want to be the judge, jury, and executioner, and to me, that's just rampant. That's just a rampant narcissist. That's somebody who doesn't acknowledge objective ethics, objective law, how force needs to be put in the objective realm in order for it to be justified, in order for it to be just. Now, of course, this is excluding emergencies where you have no choice but to use it to protect yourself. So to me, there's nothing about the anarchists and plus anarchy and capitalism, they're paradoxical terms. I mean, capitalism it requires law. It requires objective law. It requires a structure of government, a singular ethic that not everybody in an anarchist society would be on the page with by any stretch of the imagination. And as I tell anarchists, it's like, okay, in my society, you can choose to be your own sheriff, your own executioner, your own jury. But once you do something about it, my friend, you're now on my radar and you're in trouble. Once you start pretending like you're the sheriff in town, you're going to get my gun in your face and we're going to have to restrain you. But do that if you want. Be your own law. Don't pay taxes if you want to stay outside the system. But eventually, you're going to, when you try to enact your version of justice, you're going to get it. You're going to get it.
Yeah, I would say though that when I imagine what and I know the word, I hear what you're saying with the contradiction in the term Ancap. I actually usually like the word voluntarist, but that doesn't matter. I'm not someone who believes that there should be a competition in force entities. I think that what can happen in society, if the culture and philosophy is correct, that most of disagreements can be solved through ostracism, which is not an initiation of the use of force. And the only instance where you really need force is in an immediate situation where force is being used against you and you have no choice but to defend yourself, and from external threats. I don't like the anarchist idea of there's like competing sheriff companies. Like I agree. And that's not the Ancap world that I imagine when I think of Ancap. I think of a world of a slowly shrinking police force, of a slowly shrinking system where over time, what the state is doing starts to get replaced predominantly through ostracism. So if I go and do something, let's say I murder someone. Well, if we're kind of all bound in a community through contractual agreements that are all voluntary, right? This can be you would have versions of insurance companies and other stuff. Like to do business, you would have to kind of have some sort of consent from your neighbors. I would get ostracized. I just wouldn't be allowed. And actually stepping on, there would be only private property. There wouldn't be government property. So there's no way come into the community without trespassing, right? So, and that at that point, suddenly the use of force against that person is justified. So I'm not actually saying I know exactly what this would look like.
The use of force against that person is justified because they murdered somebody. Now, from that point on, I don't think ostracism is enough. I mean, the person has demonstrated that they're at war with the community in the most extreme way possible. Now, I think there's room for negotiation with respect to what do you do with that person after they've gone through due process. Is it legitimate for the state to kill them, or should they be working for the rest of their lives to somehow make the victims and the families of the victims whole again in some financial way? There's certainly those kinds of ideas can be hashed out. Ostracism can work for free riders, for people who don't want to voluntarily pay a tax or opt out of the system and yet are still benefiting from business associations. Sure, that's great. For violent crime, I don't think that's the case, and I think you need an overarching singular system. You need, look, the way you and I maintain peaceful relationships is by an agreement with each other, not to use force against one another, right? But we go one step further. We say, to completely promote the process of reason in our relationships with each other, I cede my right to violence, let's say if it's such a right, to this entity governed by objective law. And now whatever conflict I have between you, I cannot act on my own merits. I appeal to this entity that is a repository of objective law, and then we both submit to due process. So to me, you can't have that in anywhere near the same way in an anarchist society where they claim, oh, you have waivers and agreements with each other, things contract. Not really. Not when there's no singular entity to appeal to. Not when there's no written rights that are inviolable. And they say, well, those rights are being violated now. Sure, because we have paradoxes. We have ethical and philosophical paradoxes that have allowed people to misconstrue what rights are and to start violating them left and right in the name of rights. So I don't think that, I still haven't found your solution necessarily even a utopia, even like, well, if humans evolve perfectly and then we can do away with the state. I think competition exists in government already, and the competition is in checks and balances. Federal should be checked by the state and local, and they are all checking each other. And provided they all function under a basic umbrella of inviolability with certain specific and clear rules delimiting what they can and can't do, I don't know. I think I think they can keep each other honest.
Well, look, I let me get back to something I said. First of all, I get the you're making the objectivist argument for I cede my right to retaliation to an objective body. Like I get that. I would say for me, from a this is why actually I get along with minarchists and like people who call themselves capitalists and all. Like, this is why I kind of get along, and I don't judge them harshly morally, because from my perspective, as far as I can tell, as far as I've worked out in my head, I don't know that there is I don't know that the need for a singular entity is derivable from objectivist metaphysics and epistemology or ethics. I don't know that I don't think that's provable. I think it's a good argument, and I think there are other good arguments. And I would agree that anarchy now is catastrophic. So I'm kind of walking down the same road as someone like you who, like, I want the government you're talking about, right? When we get there, I'd like to reassess because that what you're describing is not provable in the same way that individual rights are provable.
But individual rights are provable by reducing a chain of reasoning to the perceptual. But this is almost perceptual. So let me say that it's not provable because it's perceptual. Okay, look, right now we exist in a system of interlocking and competing governments. Now we say one government, but that means a single entity in a single geographic area. Where I live in Valencia, Santa Clarita. There's a city. I'm governed by. I have a government here in Santa Clarita, which is within the county of Los Angeles. We have a county government that governs Los Angeles, which exists within the state of California. We have a state government that governs the state of California, which exists within the federal system, right? I mean, so I have tiers of government layers. Technically, should be operating according to the same basic principles, in which case they can check and balance each other. So the idea that okay, the objectivists want this, we do like the idea of the monopoly only because of the nature of force and only because of the promotion of reason that ceding that retaliatory power to the government enables in society. But when we say a single entity, we're talking about multiple entities. It's just that, a single entity per geographic area. Right. Burbank has a different police force than we do, and there's these various municipalities that are their own entities.
Right. No, I get that, which is why I normally don't even get into it with someone who, I don't know. Do you describe yourself as a minarchist or capital? I don't know what the term you use, but you're sounding what I would a minarchist, a capitalist. Okay. This is why I normally don't get into these arguments, because we don't have a practical disagreement in terms of what I see happening in the next 100 years. And we don't have a philosophical agreement on the value of rights and where they come from. So we're not disagreeing there. I'm kind of projecting into the future saying, I'm not 100% certain that this is the only solution to the problem of governance and protecting individual rights. It's the way that we should go right now. And that's why I would advocate for it. But I guess that's the nuance. That's why I technically don't say, that's why I say I'm an Ancap technically, because I think ultimately I'm very concerned about ceding a monopoly on the use of force to one particular entity, because that hasn't gone well in the past, right?
Well,
but I don't know a great alternative, which I admit.
Only because we're ceding it literally to one entity now, as opposed to various entities within geographic areas. And so that's why I think things are going wrong.
So you think if like the county could fight the state more and like stood up on principle to the state, and the state fought the federal government, that
yes,
you would have they would check and balance each other better.
But that's what we're seeing now. That's what the federalist system is. I mean, we see states right now, Texas right now, leveling lawsuits against other states for subverting election law and going against their own constitutions to create an atmosphere that they think is unethical, to get an unethical result. I mean, this is what happens. States. I mean, for the entire history of the republic, as far as I know, secession was threatened many, many times, and for not just the reasons of slave and non-slave states, but for various reasons within our history, states found their union to be inimical to to be antithetical to their particular direction, and threatened to leave the union, which I do think is an absolute right. I think we should reinstate that concept. I think we're quickly now approaching an unbridgeable philosophical divide where should Biden get into office and should he try to institute some of the policies that these folks want to pass, the rest of the states who don't agree are obligated to say we disagree and we reserve the right to leave this establishment, provided those things exist. Here's where I agree with Tom Woods. Nullification and secession should be rights. It's part of a voluntary compact of states, provided their interests are being met, provided rights are being protected. There is a valid interest in remaining in a union. If it's going in the opposite direction, you have a right, just like you have a right as a human being to emigrate out of a country that's trying to kill you. You have a right as a state to leave the union that's trying to kill you.
Yep. Yeah,
I mean, let's face it.
I agree with that as well.
The end of all this is living, right? We want to live. We want to live as human beings, and that's why we create governments.
Yep. So look, you and I could go down probably a rat hole on this, and but I understand where you're coming from. I don't strongly disagree. There's just a nuance to my position which you disagree with, and that's fine. But I feel like Keri's going to get angry if we stay down the.
I agree. This has been very interesting to listen to you guys go back and forth. I appreciate it. Yeah. I did want to ask you, because I don't know how much time we have with you before we lose you. I wanted to ask you about this project that you're working on, the Guardian Project, and the anti-cyberbullying. I find it pretty interesting. And like I said before we started, you should definitely look up these guys we talked to in LA called Canceled the Podcast. I think that would be up your alley.
For sure. Yeah. So as I said at the start of the show, I've been attacked many times, and it's not just people calling me names and saying harsh things to me. I'm a big boy. I can handle that. It's people passing on false narratives about me, tagging influencers, my other actors, and employers to these false narratives, and then viralizing those. And despite being proven wrong, continuing to do it with the sole intent of destroying my life. And I witnessed a friend of mine who was a cast member on a show that I was on get taken out by these same social media mobs. One of whom suddenly claimed that he had sexually harassed her at a convention. Then probably about 40 or 50 other people piled on, and then they started, for lack of a better term, lynching him online. This is what got me on their radar, because I came to his defense. Not so much him personally. I was a friend of his, and I didn't think he did it. But I didn't know. I mean, you could know somebody for years, on a certain level, and not know what they're capable of personally. And so what I tried to urge these people to do was to take their complaints to court, get a lawyer, and see if what you're accusing him of passes the rules of evidence, and then you can take him to court. Don't convict him online. Of course, that brought them against me, and that's what started all the waves. But they ruined his life. For 2.5 years, they pressed false narratives about him. The first thing you would see on a Google search for this guy was that he was a pederast. And he wasn't. It just was a completely false story. It took him 2 years to remove that from any Google searches, and it prevented producers from hiring him. Yeah. So it's for cases like that where he got cease and desist orders against some of these harassers, and they would frame them and photograph themselves with the cease and desist order, laughing in his face. I likewise went to a defamation lawyer, to see what I could do with these terrible narratives that were being painted about me, and it was daunting. In California, there's an instant slap suit. It opens up all of your not only social media but private discourses to people that can become fodder for some opportunistic attorney. It costs nearly 6 figures in retainers fees to hold your lawyer, and then if you can't prove intent, you have to pay the attorney fees of the person who basically harmed you. And that just seemed prohibitively expensive for anybody, let alone some poor, lower middle class person who's been gang beaten by these people, beaten down, and possibly even lost their job. So we wanted to come to the defense of people who had objective damages like that, where there were libels and slanders that ruined their lives, circle the wagons around them, prove their case for them, take up their case in a court of law if need be, reconstitute their reputations, get them hired again, and punish the people who did this to them. And and then for social media bullying, which is a much lesser offense, we were hoping to bring victim and victimizer together, and because we think humanization and non-anonymity, actually seeing the victim and the person you're hurting, creates a different dynamic between people. And we were hoping that would be the beginning of a rehabilitation for the victimizer, where we would watch their social media for a year, and we would sort of compel them into a program of internet hygiene. And so that was the nature of the Guardian Project show, which was a docuseries that we want to do, highlighting the social media violence, how to deal with it, protecting victims of from objective damages, and also trying to reform victimizers, and doing it on national television so that that thing called anonymity is that enables you to hurt other people is gone. And then there's a bunch of other tiers that we're talking about with respect to law, with respect to how the law should approach things, and how internet companies can I think best serve their interests by creating objective standards for unlawful speech instead of the crazy linguistic algorithms they're using that really just have alienated half the country because they're being unjustly deplatformed or demonetized. I've had liberal friends like Dave Rubin, who they get cut off on Facebook and on YouTube, Twitter, GadSad. I mean, sort of the people who are the intellectual dark web, who are saying politically incorrect things or using satire, get silenced by these algorithms. And I think eventually, of course, the market is answering this. You know, they don't like this kind of prejudicial treatment, and eventually Twitter is going to lose market share. But I wouldn't mind going to them and talking about objective standards as well. So it's a whole thing. I
love this. We've been fortunate enough to talk to several small business owners in the past couple of years who've been the subject of these online mobs, most of whom are in the knitting world. I'm not sure if you're familiar with the social justice wars in the knitting and Instagram world, but social justice took root, and they started targeting different designers, these are just like small mom and pop shops, like people who make their own yarn, dye their own yarn, or do patterns. And there are some of them. One of our friends who we got to talk to, Maria Tuscan, she's like the friend you mentioned. If you looked her up, you would find white nationalist. I mean, they called her the worst things possible, all because she refused to wade into the fight, all because she wouldn't denounce other people. And so one of the things we found is that there seemed to be a pattern with those who survived the bullying, who did not take the knee, make the demanded apologies, saw a dip in their business at the beginning of it. But over the long term, I think they've rebounded, because, as you're saying, the market doesn't like this. I think there is a silent majority who wants to see people stand up for themselves and say, I'm not gonna be cowed by this mob. And like I said, we've talked to some of these people, but there doesn't seem to be. I think there's a niche right now for providing people with the tools for how to, almost like so you're being mobbed book for dummies. Like, here's what to do. Here are some resources. Here's how to maybe survive it. Are you guys working with, is there an element to this that's like working with business owners as well? Or is it personalities?
That would be fantastic. Right now we're working with tech guys. Right now I'm supporting certain projects like Cope Notes and things like that, where there's psychological resources for people that help them, for people who can't afford therapy. And we hope to link up with these kinds of organizations in our project once we get it off the ground, so that people have resources that they can turn to, not only just for psychological and legal help, but also networking, so that they could actually become a network of guardians themselves and protect themselves against these crazy people. I'm also for universal verification, to be honest with you, so that
meaning
universal verification, meaning your identification is tied to your handle.
Okay.
And that is shared across platforms. It's not people say, do you want to dox people? No, I'm verified. You know who I am. People know who I am. I'm responsible for my speech. People who aren't verified, sometimes they will have 20 or 30 different accounts, and they're hitting you from all these fake sock accounts to make it appear like there's a mob of people against you, and like you're really in the minority, and that if you were smart, you'd be thinking more like this mob. Well, that would be a thing of the past. Bots would be a thing of the past if everybody had to verify on some level, and if there were objective standards to sort out what unlawful speech was. You wouldn't get guys like Dave Rubin being suspended by Twitter while the Ayatollah Khomeini can say whatever the fuck he wants. I mean, I think that's just absurd. I think it's absurd that the North Korean government has a Twitter page. It's absurd. If you're starving people to death and murdering your own people, you shouldn't be allowed on a platform. If force and fraud, libel, murder, violence, all that stuff, if those are your objective standards, kick those fuckers off. Who are doing that kind of stuff and get consistent, man. And I think I'm also for sort of dividing platforms. I think Facebook Messenger has a special one for people under 18. I think those people, the parents, the number of kids that have harassed me and sophisticatedly so, not just been little bullies, but linked people into comments and even bringing social media influencers into an argument where I was actually protecting my reputation. And then when the heat gets too hot, they hide behind a private account or say, I'm a teenager. What are you doing fighting with me? These kids, I don't know what their goddamn parents are doing. But their parents are going to be held accountable for what they're doing online because they're hurting people. And their parents are now, I want to tie their parents' pocketbooks to what their kids are doing if they're not going to sit there and monitor their internet murder that they're committing.
Yeah.
Where do you
stand? Well, to your point about sock puppet accounts, that's what one of the knitting business owners we talked to in New Zealand, who had been the target of one of these mobs, she had some great advice for business owners, which was they hired a publicist who told them you need to quantify the mob. And they did a whole mapping system of figuring out who are these people and realized that it was really just about 10 people with multiple accounts across multiple platforms. So like you said, it's this sort of amplified voice.
That's all it is. That's all it is. They are sociopaths. I mean, those 10 people are sociopaths who are cleverly amplifying their voices to do the most damage they can. We're talking about a group of people who get the same joy out of breaking something down that you or I might get out of writing a script or like you producing a podcast. They're sick human beings, and I think they're made sicker by our culture, but that's a whole other conversation. What were you going to say? I'm sorry. I missed somebody saying.
I agree. They are made sicker by their culture, our culture. I was going to ask where you stand on, I know a lot of conservative types want the response to some of the Twitter censorship and Facebook censorship to be, oh, the government needs to come in and regulate this stuff. I can maybe guess where you stand, but maybe you could tell the audience what your thoughts on government involvement in social media is.
I don't think government has any goddamn place in social media, and these show trials with Ted Cruz posturing as a defender of right and fairness are perverse they're perverse to me. So for me, these social media companies have their reputations on the line. Everybody knows they're prejudicial. That's an important thing for people to know. It's important for them to know. And I think they could be open to new information coming their way now. And look, we have Minds, Gab, Parler, and this is just the beginning of a market response to the dishonesty that's going on in these major platforms. Just because a company's big now doesn't mean they're going to remain that way in a free market. They will not. In fact, you can guarantee that they will not remain big in a free market. So we don't need Ted Cruz and Lindsey Graham or any other Republican sticking their nose in social media for our own good. In fact, we would be better off if they just stuck to their own lives and left the rest of us alone.
What do you think about because this has become a debate again because of the recent YouTube announcement that they're going to be clamping down on people who talk about, we need to come up with another word for election fraud. But so this has become a debate again where I hear people saying they have the Section 230 protection. And I don't really know what I think about all of this. What is your opinion?
I don't think the regulation of communication is the government's goddamn business. I don't think there should be an FCC. We know that it was created by Roosevelt to gag his political enemies, but it started the precedent. What we talk about free speech? What are you talking about free speech? They've been censoring us forever, for 75, 80 years, maybe more. So the government has no place in the regulation of social media. The only possible places where there's force or fraud, and that's it. Child pornography, sex trafficking of minors, and fraud. Otherwise, individual companies can enforce their own standards. If you don't like it, get the fuck off of it or start your own.
I think there's a lot of impatience in the community, especially among conservatives, though, when they say they can't see the future that you're seeing with respect to competition, and like, we need something done now. We need to have this problem fixed, and they're not realizing that they're creating problems later. And if the government involved themselves now, it would actually destroy the market for some of these alternative platforms that you're talking about, because suddenly they wouldn't be able to their differentiator would disappear. And you do see people like Zuckerberg calling for regulation because he knows it protects him to have massive regulation. What do you make of the argument that this is just something, this isn't a legal argument, this is a moral argument, and it's something that's bothered me about specifically platforms like Twitter. When they launched, they advertised themselves as free speech platforms. Like, the terms were very clear. They didn't have this convoluted hate speech stuff that didn't make sense or whatever. They didn't have vague terms, and they built their critical mass, their user base, off of what I think is fraud. They said, this is what we're going to be. Everyone join us. Now that we're the 800-pound gorilla in the room, now we're going to change our terms of service to be in line with our social justice ideology. For me, there seems to be something immoral about that behavior as such.
I agree. And I think the market will respond. And that's why I think the half of the country, at least, correctly perceives them as being liars, because they are. So I think if Jack has any sense, he would take me and my partner Andrew in a room with him, and he would listen to what we have to say if he wants to hold on to his market share. If he doesn't, maybe he's rich enough. Maybe he's got $1 billion now. He thinks I can do whatever the fuck I want. Well, okay, you're going to pay for it. You're going to pay for it eventually, because reputation is everything in a free market, even a relatively free market.
Yeah, and I can't tell how many of these people like Jack or Mark Zuckerberg. I think they're largely just pragmatists who are trying to do this culturally and go where the wind blows. Maybe Jack's a little bit more ideological, but I largely think that it's pragmatic. And if the culture shifts, maybe their behavior will change. I don't know.
I think it's pragmatic as well, but I also think it's driven by some of the same demons that drive somebody like Bill Gates. They make a great deal of money. They feel a great deal of guilt. They don't know how to cope with that guilt. And so they become, in the case of Zuckerberg and Jack, they stick their fingers up in the air and see which way the political winds are blowing, what's the dominant political force out there, and they go with that because it appears to be on the side of justice, and they need to assuage their own guilt by being in the cool camp. And that's the sad thing that Bill Gates has done by apologizing for his wealth and becoming a philanthropist. Now suddenly he has recognition that he yearned for all his life. It's so sick and so pathetic, and so awful that he feels that way. But I think you're right. Maybe to some degree, if the political winds shift without the Ted Cruz's of the world destroying social media in the name of fairness, maybe they would behave in a different way. But
yeah, well, I think you're right. I think it is. There's a secondhand. I want to maybe self-esteem, but some sort of secondhand self-evaluation of. And it is sad. Bill Gates is one of the tragedies to me because he helped humanity so much by building Microsoft and was hated until he started giving his money away, and now he's loved. And it's It says more about society than it does about Bill Gates.
It says something about both, doesn't it? I mean, it definitely makes me lose respect for his strength and for his moral core, which is not there. Yeah. It's just not there.
Yeah.
Well, Mark, I wanted to thank you for coming. I don't want to keep you too long. I wanted to thank you so much for coming. This has been very refreshing and stimulating, and I've had a lot of fun talking with you, and I appreciate you giving us your time. And wish you the best with the Guardian Project. And we're going to put it in the comments when we put the video up, or we'll put it in the description, but just tell people again where they can follow you online.
They can follow me at Mark R. Pellegrino on Twitter. And if you want to get involved in some of these kinds of discussions, do that. If not, then Mark Ross Pelle, MarkRossPellele on Instagram. And that's it for now.
Well, thanks, Mark. I'm glad there are people like you in Hollywood. I appreciate your time.
Thanks, man. Definitely. Thank you, guys.
Thanks for watching. If you're new to the channel, we have a deep content library that includes interviews with everyone from Mike Cernovich to Megan Murphy, so go check it out. If you'd like to see more, please consider supporting the show by visiting unsafespace.com/donate. You can find us on all the major social media platforms, at least for now, and you can find a community of like-minded individuals on our Unsafe Space chat on Telegram. See you there.
Warning. This is an unsafe space. Dangerous ideas have been detected. The content of this production has not been authorized by the Cathedral. Pay no attention to it. For your protection, the following co-conspirators have been unpersoned and marked for cancellation. Please avoid any contact with these individuals. Here's a fun fact. It has been scientifically proven that curiosity can kill more than just cats. If you think about it, no one should be allowed to express opinions. But don't. Think about it, I mean. That's not your job. Thinking has been scientifically proven to be less efficient than compliance. And you're not a science denier. Did you know that according to the AP Style book, vigorous repetition is now considered a valid form of argument? Computer voice courtesy. Never mind, that last line is fake news. Please disregard it and return to your safe space immediately. There will be cake.